Good morning. We have assembled here a pretty incredible group of people. One of the most renowned human rights lawyers, one of the most badass and toughest activists you'll ever meet, and a world-famous neuroscientist. And we have the challenge of discussing openly and honestly the idea of discrimination, the idea of exclusion, of why we do it, what it feels like, and how do we navigate progress in a world where those issues are so prevalent day to day. You know, I'm a neuroscientist myself, so perhaps I have my own biases in talking about this. But I wanted to start the discussion just by framing for all of us, the human brain is one of the most incredible pieces of technology that we have. And brief audience poll, how many of you have a brain? No one is raising their hands. That's very discouraging. Great, that's at least 3 people. So the truth is that the human brain is truly the lowest common denominator that we share. It unites us in the same amount, if not more, than it divides us. We share certain core processes, irrespective of skin color, of sexual orientation, of where we come from, of where we're going. We all share that piece of technology that brings us all onto a level playing field on some level. Yet at the same time, that same piece of technology lies at the heart of how we think about others, how we think about our countries, our nations, our futures, and those thoughts, the things that lay the seeds for either tremendous acts of kindness or tremendous acts of hatred, for peace or for conflict. And it's the same piece of technology that not only commits potentially acts of discrimination or exclusion, but also is on the receiving end of those things. So I want to start our discussion looking at the receiving end of not how does discrimination and exclusion look as in the brain as we commit it, but what happens when an individual experiences that and feels that in the body and the mind. And I'll turn to Sunitha to start.
Namaskar. Let me speak from the Indian context of what discrimination feels like and looks like. It perhaps starts maybe a little before conception itself, before the egg and the sperm meet, and a zygote is formed. You're told in multiple ways, in 1,000 ways, that you're not welcome. And you don't need to come to this world at all. And if by chance that you become the fetus, then you're told to eliminate it. And if that doesn't happen, you're born, and then you're killed. And if you're not killed, and if you survive that experience, then it's about telling you in 1,000 ways that you're a worthless piece of flesh. You don't have any of your faculty which is useful. You have some orifices in your body which could be useful, and that your identity, your honor, your everything is located in one such orifice called as vagina, and that is what makes you. And so if it means that even if it's a 9-month baby, that baby will not be spared. We just had a murder of a 9-month baby who was raped and murdered last evening in my city. Discrimination starts from there. And this person believes that she is a worthless piece of flesh. And the situations that I work in, prostitution and rescuing girls from prostitution, by the time that particular situation happens, she believes that I am absolutely a worthless being, and what is happening to me is what I deserve. Discrimination to me is about a whole world of exclusion, from access to opportunities, access to the basic nutrition, but even the right to live. Discrimination to me is about making me believe that I am an object that has to be used again and again. Discrimination for me is also about endorsing a whole world of unquenchable libido, which believes that if that is not quenched, my children are not going to be safe, and therefore this being has to be the sacrificial lamb. So from the space that I come from the space of gender-based violence and rescue of women and children from prostitution, I'm talking about 3 million such women and children in India. The youngest that I have rescued is around 3 years old, and nobody thinks anything is wrong. It's okay. To me, that is how deep the discrimination is.
Becca, you're working with a very different, in some ways similar, but different population in multiple contexts, working with refugees around the world who are navigating a system that is very complex, the system of asylum and of applying for asylum and resettlement. How do you see this daily in your work?
I mean, in terms of, this is on, right? It just does, I don't hear the other way. Okay. I think I don't claim to speak for what discrimination feels like for the people that I work with. We work with refugees and forced migrants all over the world. I actually don't really like the word refugee because it relies on a definition that hasn't been updated since like 1951. So for example, like people fleeing climate change are not refugees. Like when the whole island of Tuvalu goes underwater and everyone in Tuvalu needs another place to live, technically the international community is not going to consider any of those people refugees. So I like to talk about forced migrants who are, people who migrated but didn't have another choice. And obviously discrimination is pretty rampant against that population. First of all, it's usually discrimination that causes you to flee in the first place. Whether it's like the Islamic State going after you because you're gay or having an interreligious marriage, or the Myanmar state going after you because you're a Rohingya. Many people are originally forced to flee because of the severe discrimination that they face in their home countries. And then I think, both an ancient but also a fairly recent phenomenon that's been really stirred up is this kind of scapegoating of refugees and migrants for the world's ills. And to me, there's a lot of historical analogs. As a Jewish person, the one that rings closest is, the sort of Weimar Republic and the blaming of the Jews for the disintegration of the German economy following World War I. But I'm from the States, and I see the president, I don't want to say my president, but I see the president of the United States doing that, of sort of trying to gain political power by doing fear-mongering amongst refugees and immigrants. I think the same thing is happening in Europe. And so the way that strikes me, vis-a-vis kind of discrimination and cognition, is twofold. One is that discrimination is being used as a political tool to try to gain power. And two, that it's manifesting in sort of a wholly arbitrary way against people who literally weren't even present for whatever social conditions took place that made sort of the alt-right leaders need to rise to power in the first place. But they're the easiest victims to blame because they themselves have the least power. And then discrimination comes down really in the form of borders, which is I didn't choose to be American. I could have been born in Warsaw in 1935. And then I would have probably been killed in the camps with the rest of my ancestors, but I wasn't. I was born in California in 1981. And that's not because of anything I did to deserve that. It's just sort of the luck and the arbitrariness and the accident of where you were born. And so I really wish that global leaders and the populations that follow them would quit discriminating against people for essentially losing the birth lottery and being born in the wrong place.
As always, very passionate, and your experience is incredible, and thanks to you both. Rafa, anything you want to add on this front?
I can approach the problem as a scientist, and discrimination, like any human behavior, doesn't come out of thin air. It's actually generated by our brains. In fact, it's more than behavior. The brains generate our minds, so that's everything that we are, our identity, our beliefs, our memories, our personalities, our feelings. everything that constitutes your mind is actually not some sort of magic. It's the result of the activity of neurons that we have inside our skull. And as humans, we've treated our brains as some sort of black box where all kinds of interesting things happen, and the outcome of that is our behavior. And as a scientist working on brains, I can tell you that we still don't understand enough of what goes inside to help explain how discrimination or hatred arises. But what I can tell you is, looking towards the future, I can tell you what's coming, and that I think it's becoming very clear that as we open up the box and decipher what's inside, we're going to understand for the first time who we are, understand ourselves, and actually it's very appropriate that we're here in Athens because this could be a similar moment in history to what happened 400 years BC with the explosion of knowledge in the Athenian republic in the state here. So I could imagine that we're going to end up with a new renaissance where we'll understand our behavior from the inside. So we won't have to make guesses, but we'll actually know how these things happen. And this is very important because it's going to change the rules of the society. So with a group of other 25 people like me, neuroscientists, experts in AI, experts in ethics, legal scholars, and representatives from many different countries, we're actually proposing to expand the definition of human rights to include protection against the ill use of technology and information that's going to come from essentially open up this black box and looking inside our minds. And two of the critical issues that we're focused on has to do with discrimination. The first, we just want to make sure that the principle that rules our societies in the future is the principle of justice, that everyone should have the same right as everyone else, and that should prevent the use of these technologies to augment and facilitate the life of certain groups of people that have the resources of certain countries where these resources live versus others. And also, as neuroscience and AI merge, to prevent the spread into our brains of the biases and discriminatory beliefs that many of these algorithms of AI that are spreading through the internet have.
I want to push on that for a second because we know that algorithms can be racist too. Technology reflects its creator, and the creator of a lot of neurotechnologies and AI represents a very small segment of society. So I do want to go back to the black box of the brain, but before that, I was wondering if you could just comment on what are the necessary educational and policy systems that need to be set up, or other things, to prevent the development of neurotechnology from being dominated by white male scientists?
Yeah, I think we have a typical situation where science goes ahead of the society, and there's a new technology on the table. In this case, is both AI and neurotechnology. And the people that are creating this technology which are not evil people. They just are either curious or they want to advance knowledge. People like myself, we just want to help patients, for example. So it's our duty to try to build this technology to understand how the brain works. But many of these people are really not trained in ethical or social issues. So one of our ideas is to propose to copy the model of medicine. It's actually very interesting, again, that we're here in Athens, because 2,000 years ago, the Hippocratic Oath is instituted, so that every doctor since then swears to use the knowledge acquired during training to help people, to help mankind. So we wanted to use that model for artificial intelligence, for the internet, that the people that are building these algorithms, which, as you correctly point out, not only are there white males, they're completely unencumbered with any outcome that these algorithms have in the society. They should own this problem and take a responsibility and make a technocratic oath so that none of these algorithms that we have in our phones is releasing to the public without someone signing on to this, that it actually has taken personal responsibility, just like a doctor takes personal responsibility for treating a patient. So this is even more important because these algorithms can have wide repercussions in society.
My work is done here, so Becca and Sunita both want to say things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, you know, white men being curious, but I think it's also white men driven by profit, right? Like artificial intelligence isn't only being developed in like an isolated intellectual sphere. I mean, I'm from the Bay Area and there's tons, I mean, Google has invested a ton of money. There's a ton of different companies that are looking at how to profit off of the development of artificial intelligence. So the thing that makes me nervous is not just like who's designing it, but that I don't think it's purely a pursuit in like intellectual curiosity that's not tied to anything. I think it's deeply entrenched with market economics.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, but I wanted again to go back to the medical example. So we don't want to shut down all the industry. Look at what happened in medicine. So some of the largest companies of the world are biopharmaceutical companies, and they are driven by profit, yet they play by the rules, and they're accountable.
You think biopharmaceutical companies play by the rules?
Well, to some extent, something terrible happens, and the CEO or it's actually accountable. The drugs have to be proven, at least in many parts of the world, through a very rigorous process, which may not be perfect, but it's not terrible either. You have to go through the FDA approval in the US, you have to go through the European Medicament Commission in Europe. So there are some societal structures in place to ensure that these profit-driven companies release products that are not harmful for the population. If they are harmful, someone goes to jail. They're actually personally accountable. So we just want to use that model and apply it to AI. So just imagine, again, Google, the head of Google, they release an algorithm, they do terrible things. Well, that guy is personally responsible. He can go to jail. Just like the head of the OxyContin disaster in the US, these people are actually accountable. So there's I don't think it's that terrible. I think that there are some structures that we can make use of to rechannel the growth of this new industry that's ahead of the society to ensure that it actually delivers us the society that we want.
I like to go a little more basic. I want to differentiate between literacy and education. I personally believe that you're knowing ABCD and acquiring PhDs and big degrees doesn't make you educated. So, and that differentiation for me is very important because I think when our inner engineering is completely screwed up, all that Rafael is talking is just not making sense to me. In this audience, all these people here, how many of them feel accountable to respond to, say, discrimination? You see the newspaper, and I'm telling you a story of a 9-month baby being raped and murdered, or millions of children, young women, who just because they're born women are sold into sexual slavery. How many of us feel accountable to respond? It's just an information, just a story.
So
Does our so-called literacy raise our critical consciousness to even apply the information that we are gathering to respond in our day-to-day lives? And discrimination is not something only the refugees go through or such children or women go through. It happens every day in our life.
I agree that we're in a world of education and of increasing opportunities for learning. There's still a massive barrier and a frontier. As Rafael said, the black box that's in our heads, we know so much about it, but we also know so little about it still. And we don't talk about how we as individuals, despite all the knowledge and tools that we have at our disposal, can still be incredibly shitty to one another. So going back into the black box, into the wiring, the engineering of ourselves, as you said, We know that babies aren't born racist, they aren't born discriminatory. When you work with toddlers, it's not till about age 3 to 5 that young children start to display preferences for playmates of a certain race, of preferences for playmates who are white. And this phenomenon happens with white kids as well as black kids. So you do have to learn to be discriminatory. So why do we become discriminatory? Why do we become the way we are? Why do we discriminate? What are the key causal factors, in your opinion?
Actually, if I can pick up on that question, actually inspired by Henry Tim's keynote, you could argue that, in answer to you, that maybe we have the responsibility, every one of us, to own the problem, not to wait for other people to solve the problem, but to actually do something about it. No? So spread out in a community base the responsibility to ensure that there's no discrimination, that there's no biases. So from that point of view, I think it's a little bit of a switch in the model. Instead of sitting here and complaining that the particular power, the particular structure is evil, we can actually say, you know what, we are all responsible here. So you're going to boo me out of the stage, but I cannot help think that in Athens this is exactly what happened, where the power is essentially passed in a democratic fashion. I think it was Solon or whoever did it, to the people, and that's a critical step. No? So maybe in terms of raising these children in the future, just by like saying it takes a whole village to raise the children, maybe if every one of us owns a little bit of a problem and ensures that this doesn't happen, then that could be much more effective than to have a set of rules with one power that's enforcing them. No?
I think happening and not happening is about confronting one's own self. How do I view, say, a woman's body? What is the construct or the identity of a woman's personhood that's fed into me right from my childhood? As a woman, as a man, how do I view each other? These are some very uncomfortable questions that is fed into us right from our birth. When a girl child, I'm sure not just in India but across the world, and Me Too movement has shown that. People have spoken about what they have gone through 20 years and 15 years later after the incident happened. That means for 15 years they carried the burden of shame. And it's the same thing in my country too, where you're fed to believe that this is something that will make you small. And another person is fed to believe that this is what will make you feel powerful. And these are questions which are too personal. And how prepared are we mentally to ask those uncomfortable questions to our own selves, that we are the problem? And if we have to be the solution, we have to acknowledge that we are the problem. I don't know whether I'm making sense, because for me, discrimination, exclusion, identity is all part of one larger conspiracy of how we construct ourselves.
And I don't know the cognitive science because I'm the opposite of that. I'm a lawyer. But I do think that people are born with certain traits that make them susceptible to the sort of larger conspiracy that Sunita is referring to, which includes discrimination, right? There's like survivalist instincts and this like mindset of scarcity. I think so often when a discriminatory framework is established, it's based on this idea that like there isn't enough for everyone, right? Like there's not enough food, there's not enough land in a country, there's not enough power in a society, and the sort of like groupthink that results, or the need to like isolate certain people from rights or privileges, oftentimes I think has more to do with this sort of Darwinian need to like survive than it does with like the social constructs around discrimination. I think the social constructs are like a useful tool for creating an other, but that it does prey on things that I do think are innately human.
I think just adding to what Becca said, that I would like to add two more words to it. Fear is also something that contributes to discrimination and some imaginary misinformation. And again, I go back to my own work when this very, very, very literate woman, I keep using the word literate because to me she's just literate, who actually, shouted at me in a public meeting. She said, "How dare you rehabilitate all these women out of sex slavery? If all of them get rehabilitated, what will happen to my daughter? She can't walk on the road." So there's a genuine fear that she feels that men in our society have this unquenchable libido. If that is not satisfied by a class of people, her children, her daughters are going to be unsafe on the road. And I think fear of different kinds, maybe the refugees, it would be, oh, they take away our jobs, they take away our spaces. Fear of some kind also kind of, triggers and fosters discrimination.
So, good. We're getting close to the part that the nerds like.
We're not nerds.
Different kinds of nerds. Nerds, a diverse group of nerds.
Yeah, don't discriminate against certain kinds of nerds over other kinds.
Fair. Well taken. It wasn't rehearsed. The brain on fear, right? Any species, humans included, when it's afraid, it behaves very, very differently than when it feels safe. This goes for social species, for non-social species. There's different structures in different regions of the brain that activate when any species is afraid. So if discrimination is a byproduct of fear of some kind, where does the responsibility to address the problem begin? Is it individuals reducing their sense of fear? Is it policy changes to prevent people from being afraid? How much of it, to Sunitha's point, how much of this is an individual burden versus a policy burden? Because we know that humans behave differently when they're afraid, whether or not that fear is justified.
So this is a classical example of what I mean of treating the problem as a black box. So we know that discrimination, let's say it rises from fear, and we know that we're somehow wired as all animals to have fear, as fear and pleasure as our two guiding lines in our behavior that nature has installed into this with billions of years of evolution. At the same time, we can do better than that. We're smart, we can figure out how that happens, how fear arises. We can understand the roots of our behavior, and that means that we could understand the roots of our unskilled aspects of our behavior, of our conflicts, of our fear or discrimination, and hopefully science can contribute positively to this problem, and by revealing the problem, we can then address it in a fundamental way so that we can put structures in place in our society which would make sure that this less skillful sides of our behavior manifest themselves. So I'm actually quite positive. That's why I think we're really, honestly, at the brink of a new renaissance, because we'll finally understand who we are. And we'll look back in the future and say, oh my God, these guys in the 20th century, 21st century, they would still kill each other. They would have all this aggression. They would discriminate against us. They didn't know better, no? So it's like when we look back at people in the past that died of diseases because they didn't understand how bacteria could actually cause them. So I'm not saying that everything is a disease, but what I'm suggesting is that understanding how our mind works from the inside should help. Hopefully science could provide help for humanity to design itself in a better way.
Taking from what he's saying is, for me, the challenge is what the science says and the findings of what comes out of scientific research is how do we demythify it and simplify it so that it is, it gets translated as a policy it gets translated into community action, it gets translated into our education curriculums, it gets translated in the way we do things. Because I think the sense of hope is that things keep changing. So what was fear, say, 1,000 years back is no more a fear today. And that, to me, is the changing cycle of life and centuries is, to me, a very big sense of hope, because what today is something that people believe is sacrosanct and just, yeah, this is it and this is happening, need not be so. And so, for me, the challenge is how do we take these findings and spread it for all levels of response, because I don't think one stakeholder can bring the change. I don't think only the state party is the only responsible person who can bring in policies to bring the change. To me, it is individual action, it is collective action, and it is also state action. So how does all these findings become all that? Because most often all these research findings just remain there. It doesn't actually go down to the normal people like us.
That's why it's so important to have this type of meetings and this type of discussion with the public. Because, again, just going back to the keynote, this is too important to leave it to someone. This has to be done by the entire society. Every one of you has to actually own the problem, know what's coming, and ensure that you're actually educated. Take it as your responsibility to educate yourself as to who you are, and then translate those sets of values in your life, in your daily life, so that they can get spread out through the population. I think it will take time, and again, we're just at the brink. We still don't understand yet how the brain works, but we will. It has to be a positive thing. I mean, look back at the history of humanity, no? How much we've advanced. Look at the progress of science and medicine, no? How in the last 500 years it's been absolutely tremendous. Why shouldn't it continue? Why shouldn't it be, again, a force of liberation and greater freedom in the society?
I mean, I was originally going to make the point that Sunita made, which is, I felt like what you teed up was a little bit of a false dichotomy between like policymakers and individuals, when in fact, if we live in, a democracy, and I put that in air quotes, there should be like a continuum between those things. The one thing I'll add is that, while I think it's important that we hold ourselves individually responsible, I also think it's important that we hold our states accountable, and that we're in a pretty unique position to do that, so that if the leader of your country is saying really racist and discriminatory things to justify, just to pick a random example, taking children away from their parents and keeping them in freezers overnight and not giving them toothbrushes, that you not stop with recognizing a bias in yourself, but be willing to stand up and identify the discrimination that's happening at the nation-state level and call it out and organize and vote better.
But also, I think we need to acknowledge who's the state. They're not somebody coming from the outer planet. State is an entity that's coming through us. It is from us. And so the attitude and biases that we carry is what you see there. And the fact that a huge number of us choose to remain silent, when it is, you can see it starkly, clearly, that this is discriminatory. You just are, you feel comfortable in your silence. What about that crime? Because,
why do people remain silent?
Pardon me?
Why do people remain silent?
Maybe to remain safe. Maybe they feel that, to speak up is going to put them in threat situations. But do we realize that it is in our silence that we perpetuate crime of this kind? And as much as we take state accountability, I think it's very important for each one of us to start questioning our individual accountability. So many things happen around us, and we choose to remain silent, or we just kind of look that side. It's not that we have not seen it, and it doesn't require somebody who's working on the issue of refugees or some other crisis in the world to tell that to you. But you see it every day and you remain quiet, you remain silent for reasons best justified for your own self. And that to me is also very questionable.
I think a lot of the time people remain silent not because they're afraid or because they're hateful, but just because they're busy, which I don't think is an excuse, but I think there's a tendency to say, that over there, like, that's not my problem, right? Like trafficking of women in India, like, that's not my problem. Refugees trying to cross...
And it doesn't affect me. So it doesn't touch me. So if I will react only if my own child is kidnapped, so that is why I have serious problem in this they and us theory. Because we keep doing this they and us, and that's how we wash our hands off from our individual responses. And that is something that we need to start questioning today.
But I think in addition to, again, not speaking as a neuroscientist, but in addition to being wired for fear, I do think that the human brain is wired for empathy. And I know that I have a 3.5-year-old, so I'm aware that develops sometime after 3.5 in most kids. But I think that's a good starting point for us, is like getting rid of the us and them dichotomy by saying, like, if it's true that what we all have in common is the black box of the brain, maybe that's a place where we can start to find common ground and empathy.
But it's just so scary, empathy is. Just imagine any of these people sitting here can empathize with a 10-year-old child in a brothel, empathize with the fact that she's getting raped 40 times a day. Meaning just even give a 30 seconds thought to that space. Is it possible? I think empathy per se is a very scary emotion. And that is where people want to be cut off. They think by not talking about it, it'll not come near them. Or, just not even acknowledging about it is the safest way that we can exist.
So again, at the risk of setting up false dichotomies, there is, from a neuroscientific perspective, a very delicate relationship between empathy and fear. They exist in a balance that's very hard to have them both activated at the same time. To be afraid and to be empathetic for those who do not look like you and immediately protect you is incredibly difficult. Look at the example of Europe as well. We were able to empathize with Aylan Kurdi, the young boy who drowned on the beach, because he's a child. There's nothing threatening about a dead 3-year-old refugee. We don't care when it's people that aren't 3-year-old children drowning necessarily. So, Rafael, if you could just walk us through a little bit about what actually works to train, I'm looking at the audience questions here too, what actually works in your experience, whether it's technology or other types of interventions, to focus on those, we can call them wiring problems, we can call them cognitive challenges?
Well, I can tell you, scientists, we have the responsibility of telling you what we don't know, and this is something where I would be very cautious. We don't know enough to provide a recipe here yet. How we can train empathy, how we can deregulate fear or maintain that balance in a more positive way. We're still not there. I'm not sure we understand exactly what are the biological underpinnings of our emotions. We don't even know what is a thought. But this will happen. This is actually starting to happen. I think just going back to the comments, we're all on the same page here. I think the personal responsibility is the solution to this discrimination. Of course, we should hold the officials accountable, but maybe just the theme of the whole morning is that the power structure in the world is changing, and that the individuals now, as a group, we have more and more power than we had before. And that means power comes with responsibility, no? So we have more and more responsibility. I think that, to me, I see that very clear, that if we can walk out of this meeting this morning, every one of us, with owning a little bit more that responsibility, so that we don't walk away from these situations. I think it's the reason people don't engage is because it's just easier. It's easier to stand back and complain than to do things. Let me just tell you one One quick anecdote. I come from Spain, in the north of Spain, in the Basque Country in Navarra. There is a tradition that if you live in a village, you have to donate 100 hours a year of your time to the village work. It's called auzolan, a work of the village. So imagine you're in the middle of the Pyrenees, the storms come and they wash away the bridge. No? There are two options. You can either complain to the central authority to build you a new bridge or to declare a state of emergency, or you call an auzolan, and there's 20, 30 people in the village that volunteer and they rebuild the bridge. So this is sort of the spirit I would like to transmit. We should all own the problem. We think there's a problem, we can do something about it. We're not helpless here.
Is there any scientific research done on this black box that you were talking about, on how to kind of awaken the accountability and responsibility gene in our black box, so that could be the one that could be spread fastest?
Not yet, but this is the idea, that once we understand how that black box works and how these unskillful aspects of our personality are developed, we will see what the problem is from the beginning, and we'll be able, I'm not saying to rewire people, but we'll be able to actually build a society that is anchored on the actual knowledge of how these things work. And let me just give you another example. So crime. Okay, so what is crime? Well, society doesn't like a person, puts that person in jail. Well, what if this person has a problem in his brain that you can actually do something about it? Maybe it's a patient, not a criminal. So not just education will change, the legal rules will change once we know who we are.
I mean, exposure has been proven to create empathy, and by that I mean just, meeting someone. I think with Alan Kurdi, the Syrian Kurdish refugee child who drowned, it was in part that it was a 3-year-old and it wasn't threatening, but it was in part just that everyone saw the photograph, right? Like the media carried that photograph all over the world, and I think just being exposed to the issue is part of what triggered people to start caring about what was happening to refugees. I guess I disagree with the premise that like if the same thing happened with a photograph of a drowned adult, that it might not incite like the same strength of response, because there's the sense that children are innocent and adults maybe can be blamed for taking illegally to the Mediterranean or for having to leave their countries. But I do think that just being made aware that there's a problem and getting like a personal introduction to the problem, both like scientifically and just in sort of civil society, tends to incite empathy by making something feel more familiar and less abstract.
I don't know how long that will last, because overexposure to something also desensitizes you. Countries where sex crimes and sexual assaults and discriminations of varying degrees, maybe caste discrimination and other forms of discrimination, becomes integral part of your existence, and you normalize it so much, any amount of exposure and awareness also doesn't awaken you, because you've got so desensitized. So how far and how much of exposure? Because I personally believe that today, in this time that we are in, and with technology and everything, none of us actually have the excuse to say that we don't know. Each one of us have the access to all information. It's about that choice that we make, whether we want to see and acknowledge that information or not. Today, if one has to say, no, I don't know what is happening in South Asia, or I don't know what's happening in my backyard, it's a choice that you're making, and that's my personal, contention. That choice that you exercise within yourself to respond to something, should that be because you have been shocked to expose something?
But exposure doesn't have to mean shock. Like, I'm not saying exposure like everyone sees a really violent incident or everyone sees a picture of a dead child. I actually think you could go the opposite way. Like, a thing that's proven really effective in Europe and the US in trying to get people to be less afraid of refugees is literally just having refugees living in your community. And that's not, that's not because they're committing acts of violence or you're like tripping over dead bodies in the street. It's that like you're going to the same grocery store and your kids are going to the same school. I think there are really positive forms of ways of being exposed to people who are different from you, so that you stop thinking of them as, even just like the association of like refugees and death, right? That like the fact that that picture made it all the way around. And so most people are like, oh, refugees, those are, that's violent somehow. Those are people who die at sea, as opposed to just like, those are people who have survived something really impossible, who have, committed an incredibly like creative and entrepreneurial act in like getting their whole family out of ISIS-occupied Mosul and are willing to come here to something totally unknown just for the chance at starting their lives over. And I think being exposed to that in just a personal way of knowing people and knowing their stories can go a really long way without being violent.
Yeah, I totally agree to that, and I want to add something more to Becca's thing, because I think, to me, what occurs is inclusive spacing, and components, human being would generate that kind of fear and threat in you if you create inclusive spacing. And I always have this whole thing where several thousands of our survivors today are survivor advocates. And one of the things that people say when they meet them is, oh my God, meaning she doesn't look like a sex trafficked person. So they have this whole perception and misinformation of what a sex trafficked person would look like. And when they find a very normal person and who has normal aspirations, dreams, and wishes like anybody, and that happens only when we create mindfully a very inclusive spacing for that. It doesn't happen automatically. It is so in the space of refugees. How do we mindfully create spaces for them to come into our normal life so that the fear perception that we have gets reduced?
I want to, with the time that we have left, looking at the extensive, thank you, audience comments and questions here. Question for all three of you. Let me find it here. Discrimination is inherent in natural selection and will always exist. Free society will breed this. Go.
Sorry, free society?
Will
breed this.
Discrimination.
Why? I think we can do better than that. No? I mean, why should discrimination be our curse? Why cannot we understand how discrimination happens and just address it and prevent it? I don't see a reason why we shouldn't be able to fix the problem.
I think discrimination is a protective mantle that we very mindfully, subtly, and otherwise own and make it a part of our existence. And it need not be our curse if we are mindfully aware of it and we take a decision to, one by one set it free. It is what we create for ourselves, and we can uncreate it because this is not God's mandate or anything like that. It is human-made, and anything that is human-made can be unmade.
I mean, I think the opposite. I think that the way the world is going right now, if you can't work with people who aren't like you in order to survive, you're pretty screwed. So I think that in terms of natural selection and just the sense that like of what you need to live and reproduce and have your children live, that people who are afraid of ideas or humans or institutions that aren't like them are probably not going to make it.
And why should we be optimistic?
So we've left behind natural selection. There are many hundreds of thousands of years ago. One of the most beautiful things that have been found in the archaeological records is the preservation of the bodies of people who were actually crippled, which means that the society had kept them alive in spite of their injuries. No? So we stopped the clock with humanity. We develop a culture through our brains, and we're playing a different game. No? And again, just look at our history. You may think that things are terrible now, but I mean, if you put it in perspective, things have been improving quite significantly over the last 2,000 years. So why not? I mean, why cannot, just like going back to the example of the Basque, why cannot we, if we can build a bridge, why cannot we just get together and build a new society? No?
Nothing is static. Things have to change, provided we put our minds that we will want to change, and there are human beings across the world who refuse to be silent, who refuse to take it hands down. They will, and as long as those voices are there, optimism is there because humanity will triumph. Because there is somebody among us who will keep the flame burning.
Oh, I'm not optimistic. I just think there's no other choice because I'm not willing to give up.
That's fair. Conscious of the minute that we have left, I'll leave it to anyone for any closing remarks. And if not, Sunita, there's several questions on here for you specifically. What works? How do you get people, I'm quoting, away from couch activism, off of their asses, lots of similar sentiments. What works to get people to actually care and do something?
I think for me what works is what I can say. For me, anger works. Anger drives me to respond. That I refuse to accept things as they are. That works for me. And what also works for me is when my anger is channelized to something positive and I see positive coming out of it, that works for me. But most importantly, what works for me is I refuse to be silent. That's what works for me.
So, I think what works is the example. So I remember when I started my career, I did an experiment with a Nobel laureate, and it was a long experiment and essentially went on for more than 24 hours. And we're just alone, he and I, and he was already super famous, had a Nobel Prize, and I was just like a student. Anyway, so at some point, we're finishing up the experiment, and he took the broom and started cleaning the floor. This is a person with a Nobel Prize, okay? So it's just that those types of examples. If you see people that you care about and you see them in a situation where they're just doing the right thing, no, that works. That speaks more than 1,000 words.
Thank you. Many thanks to our panelists and to all of you for being here with us.